Right. So there's been a lot of Twitter back and forth about the de-dollarization and if it's real, if it's happening, if it's not. Last week, China and Brazil struck a deal to trade in their own currencies. The Brazilian government announced the two countries will no longer use the US dollar as an intermediary. I don't know if that's for everything they trade or for certain things they're trading. It'll be a straight yuan for reais trade. China is the top US rival, obviously, and Brazil is one of the largest economies in Latin America. What are your thoughts, generally speaking, Friedberg? I know that you have some exposure here, with your company that I think you SPAC'd recently. And you have some knowledge of the space, right?
Well, I mean, China and Brazil are pretty sizable trade partners. I think it's around $150 billion a year of bilateral trade. So China historically has made a lot of investments through their companies in railways, infrastructure, waterways, ports, and infrastructure to support the agriculture, manufacturing economies in Brazil. And it's a very deep tie. Obviously, the closeness of that relationship, China became a bigger trading partner for Brazil in 2009, surpassing the US. By the way, China has had similar trading strategies in Africa, in Australia. They've bought several companies in Australia. They've made massive infrastructure investments. The currency of trade is one element of a broader intertwining that China has kind of enabled by using its resources to invest in infrastructure development and then participating in the economic value and gain that arises from that. It still also supports the local country, the local population, the local economies in a meaningful way. I think it's worth noting that the anti-globalization moment that we're having in the US, and it may be a longer-term trend, doesn't mean that globalization and global trade is going to slow down between China and other really important, well-resourced nations around the world. So the Brazil-China summit that happened a week ago, where a lot of Brazilian executives went to China and had a very deep set of dialogues, but they also signed a ton of agreements on trade. And also in some of those cases, the trade being done in non-US dollar denominated currency is worth noting as being that if the US does continue to push for deglobalization, we can only leverage our side of those relationships. China will continue to make investments, continue to develop trade, and continue to develop really deep tie-ins with countries around the world from a resource perspective, from an economic perspective. And ultimately, the leverage will sit with them on what currency folks are going to trade in. So, what we're seeing with the China-Saudi discussion around the petro-yuan, which doesn't seem to be really a standard thing yet, but we're starting to see inklings of some deals happening in yuan, but it's more related to the depth of the Chinese trade relationship with all these nations around the world. So the more we kind of, as the US, think we want to deglobalize and reduce our trade relationships with other nations, the more, we're out of the way and allowing China to do that. I think it's worth observing that the Chinese economy will grow, the depth of their relationships will grow, potentially the strength and importance of their currency will continue to mount as they build these really deep infrastructure and investment tie-ins around the world.
Chamath, what does a party trading in yuan do with the yuan? Do they buy a bunch of stuff from China? What happens to the yuan?
Nothing.
Yeah.
This whole thing is a huge nothing burger. This is the third deal that China has done. The other two countries are Pakistan and Brazil. And the reason why is I see people on Twitter now breathlessly rambling on about de-dollarization and all of this stuff. And I think if any of these people would think from first principles, the first thing that you would know is that the yuan is pegged to the US dollar. And so as long as it's pegged, whether you trade through the US dollar or you don't and you directly go to yuan, you're indexed to the US dollar. And then you use a dollar swap to convert it into the currency you need. So I don't know. I think this is kind of like a lot of folks who don't really know what's going on.
What do you think about the depth of China's trade relationship? So forget about the denomination of the currency, but the fact that the statistic now is that China is the top trading partner with 120 countries. They surpassed the US with many of these countries over the last, decade or two in particular, and continue to increase the scale relative to the US, where we're kind of decreasing our dependence on nations and reducing our trading.
The reason why China has had so much dominance as a trading partner. And the reason why China's central bank has the largest amount of foreign US dollar reserves, about $3.5 trillion, is exactly because of the thing that you want to ignore in order to have this highfalutin intellectual conversation. It is pegged to the US dollar. And until it is unpegged in a free-floating currency, we will never know what the real market clearing price is.
And so
China
clear,
has been able to, China has been very effectively able to manipulate this currency since they were brought into the WTO in order to engender that trading partner status. They were able to artificially suppress the value of their currency so that exports from China could gain traction in countries all around the world. You have to take into account this currency peg, and you have to ask the question, where would the currency be if it wasn't free floating? And then what would the incentives be for folks to replace the dollar? And I think that there's a lot of interesting questions there that are worth asking, but I think you have to be a little bit more intellectually honest to have the discussion.
And just for clarity, Chamath, you said they already have these deals with Pakistan and Brazil.
And Russia.
You meant Pakistan and Russia, I think. They already have those deals with those two.
Pakistan and Russia.
Right. Okay, good. I just want to make sure it's clear there. Sachs, do you have any thoughts on this? Is this an example of people just maybe taking the Ray Dalio book and it fits a certain narrative and overhyping it, or do you think this is an actual real trend in the world to be concerned about?
I think de-dollarization hasn't happened yet, but I think it's a risk. And I think there's a bunch of reasons why the risk is growing. So first of all, we have $32 trillion in debt. Someone has to finance that debt. And the bigger that number gets, the more unattractive our debt is, because they have to be concerned that we're eventually going to monetize the debt, pay it back by printing a bunch of new dollars. So that's point number one, is we have these massive deficits and debts. Number two is that we have, I think, in the last couple of years, really weaponized the dollar. So if you look at like what we've done with Ukraine and Russia, we basically seized hundreds of billions of dollars of Russian reserves that were held in dollars. We've excluded them from the SWIFT banking system. We've imposed massive sanctions on them. And in fact, we now have sanctions on a huge number of countries all over the world. So we're very sanction happy. All of which makes these countries view the dollar as an unreliable store of value. Why would you store your money in something that can be taken away by the US and specifically by the State Department? So I think this is a major change in the way that we view the dollar over the last couple of years, is we're going to use it as a weapon. That, again, that makes it viewed.
Well, that's not the first time we've ever done that, right? We've done sanctions against many different
We've done sanctions, but as
Yeah.
far as I know, we've never seized foreign currency reserves and excluded a country from SWIFT, which is the banking system. So as an instrument of U.S. foreign policy. So, I mean, I could be wrong about that, but this was a major event when it happened. Remember, we also did stuff like seize the yachts and the foreign holdings of Russian oligarchs. Remember their ill-gotten gains? We suddenly decided they were ill-gotten. Let me tell you, we didn't think they were ill-gotten when those Russian billionaires were buying those yachts or buying New York real estate or London real estate.
Or investing in Facebook.
Or investing in companies
Facebook.
here or buying sports teams or what have you. So
The
we
New
didn't
Jersey
think they were
Nets.
ill-gotten. Hold on. We didn't think they were ill-gotten at the time that they were actually made and spent, but we decided subsequently we're just going to seize those things. Well, again, if you are a foreign country or a wealthy person in a foreign country, or just trying to decide where you're going to keep your money, you may not want it to be liable to the vagaries of U.S. foreign policy. So I think all these things do matter. And when you're running the kind of debt and deficits we have, and you're making the U.S. dollar less attractive, you are running a risk. I mean, that's
So we
the
should
fact.
be
So I
keeping
think
people we have disagreements with on the dollar standard, because that's good in terms of power for us.